Hey, good afternoon. I'm sorry that I could not be there today due to my health code situation. I have to stay at home, but we shall continue on. Today's topic is the French and Indian War. You have to realize that this is a huge turning point in American history. Um, and this is something that will probably appear somewhere on the AP exam because it's such a huge turning point in American history. Now, why is that the case? So, the superpowers during this time period in history and world history are the British, the French, and the Spanish. And in these three countries are trying to fight its way to become the number one superpower in the world. And so they're always pretty much fighting each other. And they're fighting over the Americas, they're fighting over the Caribbean, they're fighting over pretty much, new land in order to establish themselves as the superpower. Um, and so England and France are going to have like wars between each other throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Um, they called them global wars, but when you think about it, they weren't really global because not everyone was involved in these wars. However, because they're the superpowers, Britain and France are going back and forth between each other. Spain is still significant during this time period, but I would say, Britain and France are one and two, and Spain is three. And eventually, Spain kind of dissolves into this pseudo superpower, but eventually becomes just a second rate power in Europe. But we're not worried about Spain, we're worried about the French and the English at this moment. And so they've had a bunch of wars going back and forth, and now, kind of like the final blow between these two superpowers is the French and Indian War. Um, in Europe, they call it the Seven Years' War, but I think for American history, we call it the French and Indian War. The Seven Years' War is called that because it encompasses not only what happens in the Americas, but also what's happening overseas as well. But here in America, here in America, but Americans call it the French and Indian War because now the colonies are becoming really important to both the French and the English. So here's a map of the territories in North America. You've got the blue that represents the French. You've got the red that represents the English. And the mixture of blue and red is kind of what they're arguing over. Like the British are arguing over places to the west of their territory on the East Coast. And if you look up north there, they're also arguing about places in New France. And so this is the issue between the French and the English during this time period. Now, the war is going to be provoked by what's happening in the Ohio River Valley, which I'm going to use a marker here. The Ohio River Valley is located right here in this area here. So, what's going on is the English begin to build forts in this area, as long with the English and the French are building forts in this area as well. And so the Virginia militia sends out a very young colonel by the name of George Washington, which we're going to talk about much later, to kind of investigate and see what's going out there in the Western frontier, the borderlands. Remember, like the English have had issues with the borderlands, the lands west because of Native Americans, and now the French are out there too. So Washington and his militia go out to this area in the Ohio River Valley area, and they take over a fort that was controlled by the French. And this is going to happen in 1754. So this exchange between Washington and the French is going to be the beginning of the French and Indian War. Now, to go backwards just for a moment, just a little bit, Benjamin Franklin, who is another famous founder of America, understands the need to bring the colonies together in order to defend the British against the French and their Native American allies. And so they meet in Albany, New York. Albany is now actually the capital of New York. Albany is right, I'd say, about a 2 hour drive from New York City along the Hudson River. So you're going north from New York City to Albany, New York. And Benjamin Franklin has an idea called the Albany Plan of Union. And it pretty much says that, like, the governments within the colonies will provide resources for the defense of all the colonies. So once again, the colonies will send resources to protect the entire North American colony. Um, Now, the colonies and their governments did not like the idea of releasing their resources, releasing their taxes to this central kind of union, this idea under Benjamin Franklin. Matter of fact, actually, the King of England didn't like this idea either for the opposite reason. Like, why is it that why are the people in the colonies dictating what's happening for military actions? Like, I'm the only person who should be doing this. So you see this up here, which is in the back of my room. The idea that Benjamin Franklin was trying to promote was this idea that if we don't join together, then we are pieces of a snake, pieces of a part, and which means we were going to die. Hence, join or die. And once again, the colonial governments are too scared, too jealous to have their own taxation policies be a part of this union. Just like the king was upset because having these people, have the governments come together to form this union, which goes against what he believes should be happening in the colonies anyway. So Native Americans are going to take sides. I would say that the majority of Native Americans are going to go along with the French because the French didn't want to have permanent settlements. Like, the French had a better relationship with the Native Americans than the British did. Remember, the French would marry for trade purposes. They weren't really establishing permanent settlements here. They were here for fur trading. That's pretty much it. And so a lot of Native Americans, even though they didn't like the Europeans to be a part of their home, like, they preferred the French over the English. The Iroquois Confederation is a good example. Um, that they kind of waited to see what was happening between the British and the French, because they would have to pick a side eventually. Um, so the Iroquois Confederation will decide that they're going to pick the British side, and the Algonquins, who are kind of the rivals of the Iroquois Confederation, will pick the French side. But like I said, the majority of Native Americans are going to pick the French side because of the better relationships and the better connections they had with the British. Think about all the issues the British had. The Pequot War, Queen's Anne War, the King Philip's War. Like, the British had a more conflicting relationship than the French did. Now, as the war continues, a new prime minister, William Pitt, is going to focus the military's attention on taking over Canada. And eventually, in 1760, at the Battle of Quebec, the British will make the French surrender. And eventually, the British will now begin to control North America. In 1763, there will be a peace treaty that's signed between the French and the British, which will allow the British now to take over French Canada and Spanish Florida. If you look at the map here, I'm going to get the pen out. If you look at the map here, you can see that the yellow area is where the French controlled before 1763, and then use a different color here. After the war is over, now you see that the map is mostly purple, in which the British now control Canada and North America, pretty much east of the Mississippi River. So, what was the relationship like between the British colonists and the British government? Well, the experiences that George Washington and other British colonists had with the British military wasn't that good. The British military definitely had an ego, and they treated the British colonists like they were like second-class citizens. It's like, I always remember when I used to play rugby and Shanghai versus Nanjing, and Shanghai considered themselves to be like the best, and Nanjing is like a group of farmers. Even though everyone's Chinese, even though Shanghai and Nanjing are Chinese cities, there's definitely a different way of how the Shanghai view the Nanjing people, and similar to how the British military viewed the British colonists. The British military thought that they were better than the colonists. They spoke a different way, they dressed differently, they looked differently. The British colonists versus the British military, they are different, even though they're British. They are different. Their personalities are different. As I said, their language, even though they're speaking English, has got a different accent, and so they're different. And so the British military took a really low opinion of the colonist. Now, the colonist took a different approach, a different way of view of looking at the military. They said to themselves, wait a minute, that they weren't really that impressed with what the British military was able to do. As a matter of fact, they could probably defend themselves without the help of the British military. So you see what's happening here is that there's definitely a distinction between the two different views, the British versus the British colonists, and the British colonists versus the British, even though everyone is British. So, this is probably the most important thing to take away from the war, is the war debt and the taxation. Now, due to salutary neglect, the British colonists were able to pretty much do as they pleased. Now, due to the war, what's going to happen is, if you noticed here, this is crucial, is that how much the British government is spending on the war effort. Before the war, the most they spent was close to £5 million, but during the war, they've got 6 million, 8, 10, 12, 14. That is a lot of pounds. Let's see, it's 30, it's almost 45 million pounds was spent during the war. And then after the war is over, you see, even though the numbers go down, they're still spending a lot of money, even though the war is over. And so the British King George III, along with Parliament, began to now focus his attention on figuring out ways to now bring revenue back to the country. And so what you're going to see happening is that the navigational laws that were not enforced before are going to be enforced, and then new taxes will be applied onto the British colonists because everyone's British, right? And so the British government feels as though the colonists will want to pay because they are going to reap the benefits of the war, and so this is kind of the turning point because now you can see exactly what's going to happen between the British colonists and their attitudes towards the British military and the British government and the King George III. Just to go back for a quick moment, um, and we'll talk about it later, but the Proclamation of 1763 is I consider to be the beginning of the end between the British colonist and the British government. So thank you for your time.